I'm not going to waste time telling you the life stories of each of the people up on this panel, owing to the fact that they're so famous that you know the answers anyway. But I am going to mention that Anne Somerset is the author both of the great book on Elizabeth I, but also this wonderful book as well, which has had the most splendid reviews on Queen Victoria and her prime ministers. So she's going to be covering Elizabeth I and also Queen Victoria. And here, Helen Castor has written this wonderful book about the interaction between Richard II and Henry IV. And so she's going to take the entire Plantagenets for the purposes of this conversation. Bob Hardman, of course, has written great bestsellers on the late Queen and the present King. And I've written a book on King George III. So we reckon that across the aisle, we've got some expertise, hopefully, to talk about the evolution of the monarchy from the Plantagenets to the present day. And I'm going to ask each person in chronological order, so it's easier for me, at least, to understand the process of evolution and how it's changed over the years. So I'm going to start off with the concept of political power, of sheer political power, moving from the time when essentially to be a king was to be a dictator, through to the modern age when, with our constitutional monarchy, there are vestigial powers but not much actual power. It turns into soft power. So let's start that by turning to you, Helen, and tell us about the power of a medieval monarch, and particularly, of course, do concentrate on Henry IV and Richard II.
When thinking about the medieval monarchy, I always find it helps to hold two concepts in mind. One is authority, and the other is power in the sense of practical enforcement. Authority has to come from somewhere, and theoretically, and in the Middle Ages, it's very, very clear that authority comes from the top down, comes from God. God then anoints a king to rule over, and it is a king in the Middle Ages, a male ruler to rule over his people. That relationship is very clear early on. If we look, for instance, the immediate post-conquest period, a king only becomes a king when he is anointed and crowned. And so in the 11th century, the war between Stephen and Matilda, Stephen gets his hands on the throne by getting himself crowned, and that means he is the king in a way that Matilda can't undo. But even when we get to the king is dead, long live the king, still, when we get to Richard II, not all the water in the rough-root sea can wash the balm off from an anointed king. It's a very, very powerful collective belief that this is where authority comes from. But how does the king is one man, how does he enforce anything? And that's where the issue of the responsibilities as well as the rights of the crown come in, because the king can command all his people if he is using his authority for the good of all his people. But that is a complex relationship when you have no professional police force, you have no standing army on English soil, and you have no modern communications or transport. So actually making your God-given authority real on the ground is a lasting problem, and that is where they have to engage with their subjects. They have to engage with ideas of the common good, or that ability to command the people of your kingdom turns to dust in your hands.
And how does the situation change by the time of Elizabeth I?
Well, I mean, of course, she was a woman, so that there is obvious sort of problems with, preceded by a queen regnant, Mary Tudor, who was very unsuccessful. So that obviously meant that her position was more challenging. She's, although in theory her powers are sort of very considerable, but at the same time, she's pressured by Parliament and her ministers to marry, which she manages to evade the pressure and stay. But she has times when her back's to the wall sort of thing, and it looks like she will have to marry sort of against her will. and, and also things like with the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. I mean, her ministers and Parliament are very much sort of ganging up on her and saying, you've got to execute Mary Queen of Scots. And, I mean, to a certain extent, in the end, she's outmanoeuvred on that point. I mean, she never wanted to execute Mary Queen of Scots, although she hated her. But I mean, she's forced to do things against her will. And although, you know, still the concept of divine right does very much exist, although she doesn't sort of harp on about it quite as much as James I or somebody. But anyway, you know, the monarchy is very powerful, but she's not an absolute monarch, certainly.
By the time of George III, of course, you've had the Glorious Revolution, you've had the Civil War and the Restoration and the Glorious Revolution. So George III's powers are much more constricted, but they're still pretty extensive, especially with regard to peace and war and the appointment of prime ministers. He appointed 11 prime ministers in his very long reign, 59-year reign, and of which only 2 were any good, the elder Pitt and the younger Pitt. But, and the rest were pretty terrible, including Lord North, who was about the worst prime minister in the whole of British history. So you have a series of substandard people who the king recognises as substandard and does appoint and sack and reappoint on occasion with great regularity and power. So he still has more than just the vestigial powers. It's really after George III that the change comes, and you have the politicians getting on top, and that, of course, comes with the reign, the even longer reign of Queen Victoria. Tell us about how that happens.
Well, I mean, I was very surprised when I sort of was thinking, I wonder if I could write some sort of book about Victoria, and when I was reading biographies. You know, I was just amazed. I'd assumed, really, that she was like the late Queen. I mean, sort of very much a constitutional monarch, absolutely abiding by the rules. And I was astonished by how politically active she was. And I mean, it's perhaps not right to talk about her power. I mean, Gladstone said... during the reign, there has been a beneficial substitute of influence for power. But actually, he soon found that Queen Victoria retained the power to make his life extremely difficult. So, and although in my conclusion, I find myself saying there's not a sort of single event where you can pinpoint, you know, if it hadn't been for Victoria, things would have been very different. And I've slightly thought, why am I saying this? Why have I written this enormous book on the subject? But in fact, you know, she does definitely make her feelings known, and her feelings have to, the politicians do have to take account of her feelings very much. So, and the Baygot doctrine that the monarch has the right to be consulted, to encourage and to warn. For some reason, I was never remember. But I mean, Queen Victoria wouldn't have agreed with that at all. She'd have said, "Of course, I have a right to do much more than that." So, and she did try to do a bit more than that often.
Which brings us up to the present day. Bob, what's the situation now with regard to advising, encouraging and warning?
Well, I mean, the Bagehot doctrine sort of still applies, but I mean, we've seen really since the accession of Elizabeth II, we've seen again, it is a sort of work in progress monarchy, and it evolved under her. I mean, when you think at the start of her reign, very early on, she was expected to effectively appoint the leader of the Tory party and Prime Minister at the same time. I mean, she had to do that with Eden, with Macmillan, and with Douglas Hume as well. And you know, those were difficult decisions that she didn't like doing, and was actually pretty pleased to sort of, over the course of her reign, when you think we get to We get to 74, and there's the sort of the is Heath going to resign or not? I mean, it's a very tense time. The Queen thought, I'm going to have to get involved in this. By the time we get to the latter part of her reign, she very pointedly, ahead of the election in 2010, left London, went to Windsor, and it was made very clear to all the party, to Gordon Brown and David Cameron and everybody else, you sort this out, I'll come back when there's somebody to appoint. So we saw that sort of that gradual diminution. But at the same time, I mean, she embodied the concept of soft power. So we sort of heard about power, proper power, sort of hard power. And it's still hard under Elizabeth. It's sort of getting softer under George III and Victoria. But soft power is incredibly important, I think, in this day and age. And she absolutely personified that. You just think, I think back to times like the 70s. Britain is a complete basket case. We are a joke. The Chancellor's, famously cap in hand to the IMF. We're nearly bankrupt. No one really wants to have very much to do with the British government. However, everybody wants to meet the Queen. And the government is trying to suck up to Giscard, the French government. Giscard's the sort of man of the moment in the mid-70s. And he's not really very interested in dealing with Heath and then with Wilson. But when he's offered a state visit to come and stay with the Queen, he absolutely jumps at the chance, loves it, and out of that state visit, there's all sorts of political stuff emerges, and the Queen very cleverly, as he leaves, gives him a present of a little Labrador puppy. From her kennels at Sandringham, and it's at the time when Giscard's trying to erase the use of the English language from French public life completely. You will not sail a weekend and that sort of stuff. And she said, Mr. President, here's a puppy. I'm afraid he only speaks English. And for the rest of its life, Giscard insisted that everyone address the puppy in English. So, soft power.
What about the moment during the Scottish referendum? Was that an example of royal power being
That was, yes, that was sort of soft power with a bit of sort
Just
of...
remind the audience, especially our friends from abroad.
This is in the run-up to the Scottish referendum in 2014. Is Scotland going to secede, separate from the United Kingdom? And it's a really tricky one for the Queen because she has to stay neutral. She's above politics. However, as she said at the time of her Silver Jubilee, I was crowned Queen about United Kingdom. The clue's in the title. So I think we all knew where she was on that. She couldn't say so, but she wanted to sort of at least not be accused of being completely supine. She wanted to sort of at least get people to think, and so she very pointedly said on the way out of church at Crathie Kirk on the Sunday before the referendum, knowing that there were reporters like kind of me hanging around, I mean I wasn't, but others were, and was just talking to a lady in the crowd who said something like, good luck this week, ma'am, kind of thing. And she just said, yes, people have got to think very carefully. That's all she said. Didn't say, do this, do that. Just people have got to think very carefully. And that became the sort of big, I mean, who knows if it swayed any votes, but people clearly did think very carefully because they voted to keep the UK in one piece.
Next aspect I'd like to discuss is the monarchy and the military. Now, obviously, in the time of the Plantagenets, this is a tremendously important aspect of the crown, but not with Richard II.
Not with Richard II, and this is a theme that I just feel I ought to issue a brief correction. Sorry, it's very early this morning. Stephen and Matilda, 12th century, not 11th century. Sorry to get that one wrong.
Everyone noticed.
That's what I thought. I thought I'd better.
We just thought we weren't going to mention it.
You were all very kind,
exactly.
and But by the time we get to the 14th century, what we call the 100 Years' War between England and France had started in around 1340, and so by the time Richard II became king in 1377, it had been going on for decades. Of course, people at the time didn't know it was the 100 Years' War they were fighting. They didn't know they were only halfway through.
I always love that film that begins, "Sire, the 100 Years' War has begun."
But in all seriousness, it's a really important point to remember when you're thinking and writing about this period, because it's these labels are so powerful.
Yeah.
We know it's going to go on into the mid-15th century, but they didn't. But Richard II, the grandson of the great warrior king Edward III, who had started this war and done very well at it, the battles of Crécy, Poitiers, the capture of Calais. He'd captured the King of France, he'd captured the King of Scotland. You know, mid-14th century, little matters like the Black Death aside, are a triumph for England. And then you have a king who does not want to fight. Richard II is not interested in fighting, despite the fact that defending his realm is one of the key functions of medieval kingship. But not only does he not want to fight, there is another mode a king can take up, which is behind the front lines, strategy, diplomacy, pulling the strings of the war, even if you're not in the front line. He doesn't do that either. He just wants this tedious, boring conflict to stop. And the trouble is, wars don't work like that. So a lot of the problems that Richard gets into that reveal the fact that he doesn't actually really understand what his power is and should be, but they're precipitated by his failure to engage with the war and the fact that England, for instance, in 1386, is in really substantial danger of being invaded on the scale or greater of the Norman conquest. I mean, it is a French armada that is gathering in a Flemish port, and it's only good luck and the fact that the fleet is in fact too big, really, that saves England on that occasion. So military failings are not why Richard falls. There's an even more fundamental thing to do with his misunderstanding of kingship, but it's huge. It's huge.
Elizabeth I obviously was a warrior queen. Tell us about her.
Well, obviously, you know, the famous speech before the at Tilbury at the time of the Armada. You know, I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king. But I mean, it was very problematic for her. I mean, for a start, she was well aware that war was a bad thing because, England couldn't really afford war, so she was always trying to avoid war, and then she finds herself at war with Spain. And then she has problems that obviously she has to delegate to her sort of male generals. And she's actually very practical, and sometimes these expeditions are sent against Spain, and she sort of helps formulate sort of very sensible objectives, like saying sort of destroy Spanish ships in harbour. And the trouble is that these sort of idiotic men sort of want to go and do some much more glorious exploits, and so they sort of deviate from the agreed plan, and in fact the expeditions often end up as sort of costly failures sort of thing. So that's all problematic.
By the time of George III, he himself was the first Prince of Wales for about 250 years not to have donned military uniform. And so it has changed by then. George II, of course, had actually commanded at a battle, the Battle of Detignan in 1743. He was the commander-in-chief, great victory as well. And so it changes with George III. He has to, there are wars endlessly. He comes to power during the 7 Years' War, of course, presides disastrously over the American War of Independence, and then he goes mad by the time the Napoleonic Wars have got well underway, but he has to fight the first 11 years of them as king. And he really gives over to the military commanders, not so much the politicians, but the military commanders, the decision-making powers when it comes to the military. So it is, I think, his reign is an evolutionary sort of tipping point until you get, of course, to the modern day. Tell us about... very quickly, Queen Victoria. How interested was she in the military?
She was, again, surprisingly interested, and in things like the Boer War, she definitely feels that she gets very annoyed if the politicians dismiss a general who's been performing very badly, but she sort of says, "Oh, that's not very nice to him," sort of thing. And at one point she writes to a general after Khartoum, and she says in the 1880s and 85, she's told, no, you shouldn't communicate directly with that general. When you do that, you should do it through the War Office. And this enrages her, and she says sort of, the Liberals always try to make the Queen a machine. The Queen is not a machine. So she felt she had a very direct relationship with the army. The politicians saw it slightly differently.
Today's situation, Bob.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, I think really the Windsors, sort of the House of Windsor, the royal family has become a forces family to an extent that it probably wasn't up until then. I mean, you think about it, George VI, served at the Battle of Jutland. You and I have been lucky enough to have a look at his war diaries. Andrew's written it as well as his book on George III, which is brilliant. He's written an excellent book, well, the book on Churchill. And in there, you looked at George VI's war diaries. I looked at them for my book on the Queen, late Queen. And in there, you just see the extent to which, I mean, being a 20th century constitutional monarch, you're absolutely bound up in everything the military are doing. And that's the way the military like it. They have serious problems with politicians at times, and they love being able to just sort of go and pour their hearts out to the king. And you've got Elizabeth II. I mean, for her entire life, there probably wasn't a single day when she didn't see or talk to somebody in uniform. I mean, from growing up all through the war, by the end of the war, she's in uniform. She's with the ATS, and she's very proud of that. It gives her enormous, all the way through her life. She was so proud of the fact she obviously, due to her age, she only joined up right at the end of the war, but she'd done her bit, and by the time she died, she was the only living head of state who'd worn uniform in the Second World War, and that gave her a huge sort of kudos. And she was the daughter of a sailor. She was married to a sailor, Prince Philip, who had a very distinguished war himself. Two of her sons served. I mean, obviously Prince Andrew served in the Falklands. Charles III, he served in the Royal Navy for several years. And they've all that link with the forces go on. I mean, obviously William and Harry. Harry served in Afghanistan. William was a very distinguished air-sea rescue pilot. Someone often said to me, if you want to know the difference in character between William and Harry, just look at the aircraft they fly. Harry was sort of fighter attack helicopters. It's all, and as he wrote in his book famously. Whereas William, it's much more sort of steady as she goes. Looking at his weights and pulling people out of the sea. Someone said in the war he'd have been a great Lancaster pilot. Harry would have flown a Spitfire, but I digress. The fact is, the Windsors and the forces, they go together, and I think it works to the benefit of both.
Another very important aspect of monarchy is art, architecture, philanthropy, and also the cultural sense of what a monarch is all about. Tell us about the connections between Henry IV, Richard II, and the building Britain better, or whatever the phrase is.
I think the key concept when you look at the medieval monarchy in relation to art and architecture is magnificence. That magnificence is the proper expression of God-given majesty, and I have to say this was Richard II's extraordinary talent. Almost nothing else to point at, but his visual sense and his understanding of how art and architecture could be used to express and project the power that he believed God had given him. So his role in continuing the building of Westminster Abbey, Edward the Confessor's church, he very much valued this connection all the way back to Edward the Confessor, who he saw as having designated William the Conqueror and the line of kings who came after him as his successors. Richard did a lot of building of the nave of Westminster Abbey, but also had a life-size portrait of himself painted, which is still in the Abbey. An unprecedented piece of art in medieval England. He had a life-size effigy, golden effigy of himself and his first wife placed on the tomb that he commissioned. He wasn't anywhere near dying, but I think he rather fancied the chance to write his own epitaph. Yes, quite. And Westminster Hall, the main part of the medieval Palace of Westminster that still survives after the fire that burned almost all of the rest of it down in 1834. That's a building that was originally constructed finished in 1100, but remodelled by Richard II with the extraordinary hammer beam roof. So if you can envisage the building in which Queen Elizabeth II lay in state, that is a building finished by Richard, and the first parliament held in that remodelled building was the parliament that deposed him. So Henry was a bit busy firefighting to really get round to any major artistic commissions, but I do think his tomb in Canterbury Cathedral, which was an alabaster tomb commissioned by his second wife, is a very remarkable and human piece of art.
We think, obviously, of the Elizabethan age as being the glory age of our culture, with Spencer and Churchill, Shakespeare, and that's how much is on my mind. Are we right? And to what extent did Elizabeth herself play a part in this amazing cultural apogee?
Well, she can't take too much credit, I don't think. I mean, she did like Shakespeare plays, and Shakespeare performed before her, she was alive to the controlling of how her image, sort of thing, so that, you know, portraits had to be sort of officially sanctioned. But she actually rather hated sitting for her portrait, she left it to others to do the sort of actual financial patronage much more. And also, she inherited, a lot of magnificent palaces, and she was aware that it was important to sort of maintain the splendour of those. But she couldn't really afford to do any sort of original building herself. So, but she definitely did want to promote literature, but just without having to foot the bill herself, sort of thing.
With George III, he was a magnificent patron of the arts. He, of course, set up the Royal Academy. He brought musicians from all over the world to England. Haydn saw him as a great supporter, and he loved the works of Haydn. He was very interested in science, and of course the Georgian architecture that we all love in so many of our major cities owed a lot to the architects who he promoted, and so he's a key figure in the glories of the Georgian age. Queen Victoria?
Well, again, I think she's not so much patron of the arts. I don't think she really saw that as a way of maintaining the monarchy in people's hearts. But I suppose, architecturally, they built Balmoral, a lot of which, Osborne, which a lot of which, Prince Albert has a real part in the design. But in a way, that wasn't to promote the soft power of the monarchy. It was where she would then lock herself away, and even in the most sort of pressing political emergencies, she would refuse to come to London, and she would either be at Balmoral, where she would expect ministers to sort of travel up to see her in North Scotland, or in Osborne, which is on the Isle of Wight. So, that was very inaccessible. So that wasn't really sort of part of what she saw as a way of strengthening the monarchy, I don't think.
And the modern day?
Well, modern, I don't think anyone will ever mourn or sing the praises of modern Elizabethan architecture when we think of, what we really had in sort of 60s tower blocks and all that. But no, Elizabeth II definitely, she left her own mark in a different way, actually. As you say, Victoria built Balmoral, bought Sandringham, built Osborne. Elizabeth II sort of inherited all that, but she did stamp her mark on one thing. She was very, very fond of and played a very key part in the design of Britannia, the royal yacht, which she loved in her own way, in the same way that Victoria loved Balmoral. She and Prince Philip were all over the designs on that. She chose all the sort of inside, right down to choosing the sort of the door handles and the light fittings, and even issued directives to do with the linen. She wanted lace on her linen, and Prince Philip was to have no lace on his linen. But you know, when one looks back over the monarchy and the way it's evolved, you know, you can see clearly there are sort of connoisseur monarchs who come up through, Charles II being one, particularly George IV, who the Queen Mum used to call Old Naughty. You know, he was a terrible king, but he did have amazing taste and bought so much of what is still in the royal collection today. And Elizabeth II was certainly not a connoisseur monarch. I mean, she liked collecting bird pictures. Prince Philip was quite keen on contemporary art and also collecting Giles cartoons, which sort of littered around the place. But what she really was, she was a great curator monarch. Under her, the royal collection went from a sort of couple of dusty old curators and a sort of filing cabinet with a catalogue. I mean, it's now the biggest department of the royal household, opening up all the art, in creating the Queen's Gallery in London. There's a Queen's Gallery in Edinburgh. Really sort of taking all those that art and those treasures out to the public. And we now have on the throne, I think we've got another connoisseur monarch, actually. I mean, King Charles is an accomplished watercolourist, but much more than that, he sees his role as sort of, he wants to sort of, you know, keep extending the royal collection. He's commissioned, he's very keen on stuff that's sort of, you know, grab it while we can. So he's commissioned a whole series of portraits of Holocaust survivors, of the Windrush generation. The last sort of the old boys of D-Day, you know, and he takes it very seriously and he loves it. And he also, he's opened stuff up. He bought Dumfries House in Scotland, took out the largest mortgage since the Second World War to buy this thing because it had a completely intact collection of Chippendale furniture made for the house, and that had never been open to the public. Now it's open for all, so it goes on. The sort of patron of the arts, the way it happens is different, but it's key to being monarch, I think.
The next area we're going to cover is ritual. And I've just noticed that we are in the presence of the Clerk of the Privy Council, Antonio Romeo, who wrote the coronation roll for King Charles III. Helen, how important is ritual to a Plantagenet monarch?
Absolutely essential. Again, without televisions and so on, the public ceremonial occasions are the opportunity where more of a king's subjects can see him than at any other time. And I was really struck in the last couple of years as I was writing, having written the beginning of this book that starts with the death and funeral of a monarch who has ruled England for 50 years, and a funeral procession winds its way through the streets of London with 5 royal noblemen walking behind the coffin, 3 sons of the dead king and 2 almost sons, you know, people who've married in. And then that is followed by a coronation in Westminster Abbey, which follows, I mean, you know, the chronology is the wrong way around, but follows the ritual we've just seen. It's the same ceremony. There has been a religious shift since then. We're no longer part of the Catholic Church and the authority of the Pope, but the ceremony of crowning a king is totally recognisable from the ceremony that took place to crown Richard II in 1377 and then his cousin Henry IV in 1399. It's absolutely at the heart of what kingship is. And
George III felt much the same. He had a problem, in fact, with the key moment of the coronation ritual, which was the Protestant oath that all kings had to take since the Glorious Revolution. And this, of course, meant that at the time of the emancipation of the Roman Catholics, he felt that he was breaking his coronation oath if he allowed this to happen and to sign the bill. And so the bill didn't get signed until his son, George IV, came to power. So a sort of taking a very literalist stance over the wording of the coronation oath was something that held up the emancipation of the Catholics in this country. With regard to Queen Victoria, we remember that her coronation went magnificently wrong on many occasions, didn't we? Tell us about that.
Well, because, I mean, now we're rather, we pride ourselves so much on the sort of coronations being fantastic, spectacles and wonderful. But so one forgets that actually it was all sort of disastrous in the past. And I mean, the Archbishop, who I mean, sounds as though he's pretty sort of senile by then, he kept getting lost in saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, and he rammed the ceremonial ring on the wrong finger, so she was sort of screaming in pain. It was a sort of comical, sort of, everything was farcically bad, but, and then, in a way, the other, main ceremonial events of the reign were she was meant to open Parliament very regularly, and she always disliked doing that very much. And then after Albert dies, she just says sort of, very often, most of the time, she's sort of, it's cruel to ask a poor shrinking widow to do that, to expose herself to the public gaze. And she sort of flatly refuses a lot of the time. And then occasionally, when actually she realises that she's going to have to ask Parliament to give one or other of her children sort of a large amount of money, she thinks, well, I suppose I'll have to sort of steel myself to do it. But she makes life terribly difficult. And the wife of one minister said the Queen made all sorts of vagaries about it, and then she refuses to wear the robes of state. And but she sort of says, they can be sort of on the chair, and Lady Clarendon said they were tucked around her rather like a railway rug, and she sort of to the end of her life, and by the end, I mean, I can't remember the exact date, it's 1880 something that she does it for the last time, but after that, no one even bothers to ask her, because, it's just not going to...
Tell us about Lord Rolle.
Oh, yes, well, the aptly named Lord Rolle, at her coronation, sort of, elderly peer, came up the steps and then sort of tumbled down, so rolled down these steps, and actually, and she's very nice. I mean, she's very young, and she bends down and sort of picks him up. So that is, something she comes out quite well.
Something Anne said about the cruelty of expecting people to grieve in public, essentially. Of course, that happened in our own time with the death of Princess Diana and the expectation, didn't we, Bob, of those very young royal princes should be walking behind the coffin. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's this bizarre role of the monarch that when tragedy befalls your own family, you're effectively the shoulder on which the nation expects to cry. And the Queen did get attacked during that week after Diana's death for in her view, her priority was her grandsons, keep them close up at Balmoral, try and sort of make things as normal as possible for these poor boys. But she came under a lot of attack in the media for sort of abandoning her people. There was a sort of headline on the front of the Daily Mirror saying, "Show us you care, ma'am." And so there is that sort of obligation. It was very noticeable, I thought, after her death. The very next day, the new king, Charles III, comes down to London to deliver that extraordinary speech on the airways. But he stops the car outside the palace gates, which is exactly what the Queen did when she came down from Balmoral after the death of Diana. Stop the car outside the gates, don't drive in, get out and meet the people. And when Elizabeth II did that in 1997, it completely changed the mood music. I spoke to one of her staff who were in the crowd that day, and they just said it's like it was like a sort of tide turning. And it was the same when he came down. He got out of the car outside the palace and went up to meet people and sort of put out his hand to this woman who was in floods of tears, and she said, "I don't want to give you a handshake. Can I give you a hug?" And he went, "All right." There you've got a chap who's just lost his mother, but he's having to console a total stranger who's sort of devastated by this. So ritual and the monarchy absolutely hand in hand. It's sort of partly sort of what they're for. I mean, I love Anne's story about the Archbishop getting it all wrong at Victoria's coronation. It's usually archbishops who screw up at coronations. I mean, it's one of the reasons, one of the most ardent opponents of televising the 1953 coronation of Elizabeth II was the Archbishop of Canterbury, for precisely that reason. Because, I mean, at Edward VII's coronation, I mean, the Archbishop fainted, you know. I mean, and Justin Welby, I interviewed him for this book about the latest coronation, and he was terrified of putting St Edward's crown on the wrong way round, because actually you look at St Edward, this is sort of the crowning crown, not the imperial state crown, which the monarch wears on the way out, but the St Edward's crown, it's pretty sort of, you know, it just looks the same whichever way you look at it. And the only way, the front and the back, is the front has a square green stone, and the back has an oval green stone. And Welby said that, he said, I've got a terrible memory, but in a run up to the coronation, he just walked around his flat at Lambeth Palace, and he had this mantra go, square front, oval back, square front, oval back. So when the moment comes, and if you rewind to the coronation, you see he sort of crowns the king, and then he does a sort of... and he got it right.
Good. The last area that I'd like to cover is the idea of the royal family as a family. Relations with children and parents and so on, and this whole concept of them being a family as opposed to a particular dynasty. So, what was that like with regard to the Plantagenets?
Well, it varied an enormous amount from generation to generation. I mean, you've probably all seen The Lion in Winter and have an idea of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine and their unruly devil's brood of sons. But if we look at the 14th century, and again look at Edward III, there's a lot that's very familiar, because Edward III and his wife, Philippa of Hainault, had 12 children, of whom 6 survived into adulthood, 5 sons and a daughter. And you see some very, very recognisable family dynamics there. The one daughter actually being indulged to a remarkable degree for a medieval princess. She was jilted at the first marriage that was arranged for her, and that seems to have been such a traumatic experience that Edward then allowed her to choose her own husband. She almost married someone else, changed her mind when the ships were ready in Plymouth to take her. Didn't get married until she was 33, when she took a fancy to a French nobleman who was a hostage at the royal court, and a very appealing hostage, clearly. And so Edward said, fine, made him Earl of Bedford and let her marry him. But the boys, of course, that's a complicated group, 5 sons. You have the Black Prince, the oldest, who it's anticipated will become king. But it goes all the way through to the youngest, Thomas of Woodstock, later the Duke of Gloucester, who's only 12 years older than the boy who will be Richard II. And poor Thomas of Woodstock, I mean, it's a bit hard to feel sorry for him because he's very grumpy and a bit of a troublemaker. But you can see that he's absolutely marooned between royal generations, trying to get a title and estates that would allow him to have a political role, but also trying to find a role for himself. And then in the next generation, the Black Prince only leaves this one boy who's 10 when he comes to the throne. So a massive family, but the succession is hanging on the very narrow shoulders of one little boy who turns out to be terrible at the job.
With the Hanoverians, it's quite straightforward because they all hated each other. George I hated George II. George II hated his son, Frederick, Prince of Wales, who, by the way, used to come here. In fact, he leased this house often in the 1740s. And he was hated so much by his father, George II, that George II and his wife had a little mild celebration when he died. And didn't allow his body to be buried at Westminster Abbey until it had putrefied. And the poor little George III, the 10-year-old boy, new Prince of Wales, sleeping upstairs, could actually smell the decomposing corpse of his father, who hadn't been buried on purpose. So this is you can see, therefore, perhaps why George III didn't get on with George IV. But that really was very much George IV's problem, because he created a debt that was the then equivalent of the amount of money that Britain was spending on the Royal Navy. It's a pretty sad story, frankly. How about Queen Victoria?
Well, she certainly sort of carried on the family tradition of not getting on terribly well with her heir. But she was also, under Prince Albert's influence, became very conscious that she must sort of shake off the reputation of her uncles, the kings, who were, George IV in particular, and William IV, who were regarded as dissolute, and that Albert said that the royal family must be this sort of wonderful pillars of morality, and he was very strict on that. And to be fair, one reason why she does sort of not get on so well with her eldest son, Bertie, the Prince of Wales, is that she's pretty well aware that he is sort of reverting back to some of the bad habits of his uncles, and obviously being unfaithful to his wife and being very extravagant. So that is... but in a funny sort of way, I think, although she drove them mad, I think most of the time her children did love her, actually. And she's very bad at sort of pitting... She had 9 children, and she sort of writes to one and says sort of, oh, your sister is behaving appallingly, she's always so, mean or something. But then the next year, a different one's in favour, and she sort of slightly and then she writes that one saying the other sister that she was, oh, I'm so fed up with her. So she had, as a mother, I did think of writing a book originally about Victoria and her family, and I thought it would be quite a sort of depressing thing, because as a mother, she doesn't come out that well.
And before I get on to asking Bob about the happy family of the House of Windsor today, I would just like to point out that Meghan Markle slept up there the night before her wedding. Okay, Bob, we've literally only got 3 minutes.
Okay.
I know this could take an hour and a half very easily. Over to you.
Rich scene. We started off this thing talking about sort of royal power and authority, but actually as royal power has waned, the importance of the royal family as a unit has grown. And George V, I think, was that was a close family unit, and it was part of the great attraction of the monarchy. At the time of the First World War, the Second World War, having George VI there after his rickety brother has just abdicated because he's, as it were, sort of broken with the family. He's done a very unfamily thing, marrying an American divorcee. That's not a fact. That takes away the notion of the royal family. George VI, happy family unit. It's a very strong defining image through the war. And for Elizabeth II, family was so important. And it's why when family goes wrong, it rebounds and reverberates, I think, so badly for the monarchy, as we saw with Diana. Currently, the king comes to the throne, but he's still, very early on, he's sort of fighting on 2 fronts. You've got the whole Prince Andrew story, and we're going to hear, I don't know if Emily Maitlis is yet, we're going to hear her, I'm sure, a bit later on. Effectively, that was the end of Prince Andrew in public life, that interview. And that's still ongoing. You've got the whole problem with Harry and Meghan and their separation from the monarchy, and it goes on. It's unresolved, but it comes, I'm afraid, with sort of being a modern monarch, is you have modern families. Modern families do have their problems, and I'm sure the question that often gets asked of these things is there a return? Could Harry ever come back? To which I would say, well, never rule anything out. But at the moment, those are the 2 difficult dukes, if you like, are a problem.
And on that bombshell, we are going to hand over the microphone to anybody who's got a question. Lottie Eager.
Hi, this is a question actually, I think, for Anne. The hinge between the Stuart kings and the Hanoverian kings. How did the sort of ritual change there? But also, did the British, the English aristocracy bring in the Hanoverian king because they wanted a German-speaking king who they could boss around and who didn't really know what he was doing and was being much more their plaything?
No, I think, it was just, it was the thing that he was Protestant. I think it really was. And I mean, I don't think it was that apparent that they would be able to control George I. And in fact, I mean, it was very worrying for Anne's, because I wrote a biography of Queen Anne too, sort of thing.
Oh, I forgot about that completely.
No, that doesn't matter.
We could have come back to you even more.
Sorry, and I've lost my train of thought.
George I, coming
Oh,
back
yes.
to that.
I mean, you know, he's very cross because Queen Anne and her ministers sort of end the war they've been fighting, the War of Spanish Succession, and they make a treaty with France and pull out of the war. And I mean, George I makes, who he's fighting as George of Hanover, he's fighting the war. He's furious, and you know, and her ministers. I mean, they're really worried that when he comes to the throne, he will literally execute them, sort of thing. And they do find themselves in very serious trouble when he comes to the throne. So it's not sort of, oh, yippee, we're just going to have this sort of German dolt that we can boss about.
Right, next question. Gentleman at the front here. So I've just been adding it up. We've got the biographer of 3 queens here, of 2 kings there, of a king and a queen here. I'm feeling just with 1 king. Really quite unimpressed. Sorry, but anyway.
Thank you.
Sir.
Helen, clearly Richard and Henry had completely different management styles. Richard's belief in divine right and Henry's sort of focus on loyalty and pragmatism. What do you think were the most significant factor or factors in Richard's downfall and Henry's at least initial successes?
I would, in a sense, adjust slightly the terms of your question in that both men absolutely believed that the power of the king was given by God to him to rule over the people. The point of difference is how you do that and what it's for. And in Richard's mind, the power and the authority was his, and that any suggestion that he needed to take into account the needs or the rights even, that other people had rights in his kingdom, that was something that he struggled with, to the point that after various crises and rebuilding his power, the last 2 years of the reign really are a sort of full-blown tyranny. That is, he is no longer even paying lip service to the idea that his authority and his power should be constrained by the law. We were talking about the coronation oaths earlier, and the deposition articles say again and again and again that Richard has committed perjury because he has not kept his coronation oath to uphold the laws of the kingdom, and that means abiding by them, working within them himself as well. And that means that Henry then has to do this terrible thing of undoing a king that God has made with the support of England's people. It's very, very clear when Henry makes his move in 1399 that the kingdom is with him. And when Richard is taken through the streets of London from Westminster to the Tower, there's a story in one of the chronicles that someone shouts out at him, "Good riddance to this evil bastard who has ruled us so badly." So the legitimacy is being, I mean, they don't just mean generalised bastard as an insult, they mean, well, you can't really be the real king in that case if you know them. And actually the marriage of Richard's parents is another whole family saga, which, you know, if I had more time, I would go into. But it's that Henry is committing himself to be a king who will rule by the understood principles of what we might call the Constitution.
Next question. Lady in the middle there.
Hello? Okay. I think anybody probably could answer this. In like my research on kind of early
Sorry,
modern...
I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. And I was kind of studying early modern women and like land ownership and female monarchs, and I was kind of thinking about something that I was validated because an American political science was also thinking about it, but I was wondering what you think, the thought that maybe because England has had like female monarchs in their own right, and then also you were talking about kind of Queen Elizabeth and like as kind of almost like commander-in-chief or like working with the army, that it's like easier maybe for English people to think of women in positions of power than say like American people.
Okay, Anne, what do you think? Is it easier for English people?
I mean, after Elizabeth was on the throne for years, and I think, you know, although she managed to make a success of being a female monarch, she certainly wasn't a feminist. I mean, she didn't want to promote women's rights. She basically said, you know, I'm, of course women should be kept in their place, but I'm prince, so it doesn't apply to me, sort of thing. And then, you know, there are then centuries of, you know, male oppression. And then with, I mean...
And tell us about Anne
well,
as well, who I rather...
No.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, again, I mean, it's sort of funny in a way, because Anne was really not terribly clever or charismatic person, but she never had any doubts that that she should rule, that she and that she could do it all right, which some would say would be slightly arrogant of her. So she had sort of oddly little worries about her status. And again, I mean, people certainly had a degree of difficulty adjusting to her being. But, I mean, in theory, she was meant to be succeeded by a woman because her George, the man who became George's first mother, was the heir. So she was always going to be succeeded. And then Sophia of Hanover predeceases Anne by just a... And in Victoria's case, funnily enough, she does keep saying sort of it's ridiculous, I'm a woman, it's all wrong. But again, it seems to be what's been fated, sort of thing. So, and I don't know if it would say that you would say that it
I'd
has
say
acclimatised.
Queens have been brilliant for this country. I mean, if you know, we've since 1066 we've had 40 monarchs now. We're on the 41st. Of those 41, only 6 have been Queen Regnants. But if you ask anybody, I would say, name the top 5 monarchs in history, you are going to get Victoria, Elizabeth I and Elizabeth II on anybody's list, I think. I don't know, someone might disagree. And I think there is that sort of, maybe it's something sort of goes to the heart of, I don't know, human nature or whatever, but having a sort of a popular matriarchal figure, I think works very well for the monarchy. And yeah, in the early days, of course, there were things they couldn't do. Obviously, they couldn't have fight in battle. You know, Elizabeth II was the first one to wear a uniform. But I think we're very comfortable with Queen Regnants. And it was very interesting after the death of the Queen at the reception at the palace, all the heads of state came in. And I talked to people there, and they said there was a sort of great gravitational pull around Queen Margrethe of Denmark, because she was then become the world's senior monarch, and she's incredibly popular as well. She, of course, stepped aside for her son earlier this year. But I think in the modern world, there's the Queen Regnants or Queen's Regnant are as strong as ever.
I would just make one small point to sort of link this together, which is I think you're absolutely right. In the modern world, we're very comfortable with queens, but I think we have to remember that we're very used to female figures as figureheads. Ships, have female figureheads, but also as abstract embodiments of abstract qualities, justice, victory, so on.
Well,
we're very
the nation itself.
The nation itself. So now that the monarch no longer rules, I think it works really well having a woman fulfilling that role. I think the earlier queens had a lot more difficulty, and it's very striking. All of them, if you look at them, they don't really set a model for each other in terms of a sort of viable form of female royal leadership. Do you marry? Do you not marry? Etc. Etc.
Ladies and gentlemen, sadly, Helen has got to go off to the Gloucester Literary Festival, so she's literally got to be there by 2 o'clock or something, haven't you? So sadly, she's going to have to miss out on the book signing. Nonetheless, over there, we will be, or the rest of us will be flogging our wares, and I hope that you all agree that having the Clerk of the Privy Council is very Cliveden. Yeah. And thank you very much indeed.